Hi everyone, welcome to my channel, Tiffany's Crafty Life. In today's video, I'm going to show you the differences between brick stitch and peyote stitch. And I'll also show you how to create the two different techniques. So let's get started with brick stitch. So for brick stitch, you're going to start the first row doing ladder stitch, and this is just the first row. So here I have my colors for all the different rows. I'm using the 11 size Miyuki Delica beads. So we're going to start by doing a ladder stitch. So I'm just going to add 8 seed beads. Okay, so I have strung these 8 seed beads. So string through the last 2. Yeah, and that will get the beads side by side once you string through them that second time. Now I'm going to go through that same bead again, but not the second, just that first bead, so I could complete the same thing with the remainder of the beads. So here we're just really getting the beads in the first row into position for the rest of the brick stitch. Yeah, so there we go. It just went through that first bead again, or that just a second from the end bead again. Okay, so now you complete that ladder stitch with the rest of the beads on your string. The third from the end bead, we're going to go back through in that same direction we first added it. There we go. So see how the beads are sitting beside each other now nicely? That's what you want for the first row. So you do end up passing the needle through in different directions for each new bead. Getting that first row started is the most challenging, as you don't really have that tension set yet. So just to make it more taut your work, you just kind of pull the threads in the opposite direction. And then it's a bit easier to work with. So there you go. That's how you complete the first row for brick stitch. Now the rest of the technique will be very different. So this is your foundation. Now starting your next row, you always start the row by adding 2 beads because you want to hide your thread. So I'm going to use the next color to show you this is row 2, the second row. So we will be working this row from left to right. So instead of passing through the beads like you would in peyote, for brick stitch, you're actually going to hook through the threads. You just got to arrange the beads so they're side by side. For the first 2, just kind of tap it down. So see how these 2 beads are now stacked on top of the first row? That's what you want. And then so the thread comes back through the top because you want it at the top of the bead. Just sew back through that second pink bead, so it sits nicely on top of that first row. And you just pull the string taut every time you sew it back through that bead that was added. Now you're ready to add the next bead. So for the remainder of the row, you're just going to add a single bead, so 1 bead at a time. We just added the 2 just to get started and to hide that thread. So now we're just going to add the 1 bead. And we continue again by hooking through the threads. Here we go. And then you sew back up through that same bead that you just added. Pull that thread taut. As you continue to add more beads, you'll feel that work will get more stiff, which is perfect. It's just hard in the beginning because you don't have as many beads added yet to the project. So then you just keep on going, adding beads. So I noticed for brick stitch, the work does come out a bit more stiff compared to peyote. I think that's just the reason, well, I think that's just due to the tension of the thread, because you're able to pull the thread taut after adding each bead. So as you can see, the beads start to form what looks like a brick wall, hence why I guess it's called brick stitch. So you'll see that this second row, the beads kind of sit more on an angle. They sit like in between the beads of that previous row. Yeah, so you add a single bead, you go between the thread, and then you pass back up through that same bead that you just added. And pull the thread taut. Yeah, so to continue building your work, you just continue each new row in the same manner by starting with 2 beads and then single beads after that. But the work does end up stacking very nicely in this brick formation. If you're more comfortable to go from a left to right, you could flip your work and do it that way, or you could work right to left, whatever you're comfortable with. So we add 2 beads to start the row, pass through the thread, and pass back up through that second bead. Then you just pick up 1 bead after that, pass under the thread, and pass back up through that bead that you just added, and pull taut. Yeah, so it's similar to peyote, but your work is flipped sideways. So that structure of the 1 bead up and 1 bead down, that falls on the side of your work in brick stitch. Whereas in peyote, that will be on the top of your work. So you'll see that soon. When following a pattern, it's always good to mark your spot because you don't want to get lost on what row you're working on. So you are working from the bottom up. So remember that when you're following a pattern, that you typically do start at the bottom. If you're wondering what thread I'm using this thread here from Art Beads. It's the Naniome thread. Yeah, I got the big spool because I use it a lot. I find it's really good for these bead weaving projects, especially when you're practicing. Okay, now we're going to do peyote stitch. So again, we're going to use the same beads. Here I have the 11 size Miyuki Delica beads, my favorite. And we'll have the blue also as row 1, pink as row 2, and etc. So again, just like the brick stitch, the first row, or in this case, the first 2 rows, will be constructed differently compared to the rest of your beadwork. So for peyote stitch, so we're going to be adding the beads for the first and the second row. So we're going to pick up a blue and a pink bead, so alternating. So first row bead, and we will be alternating beads. So a bead for the first row, a bead for the second row, first row, second row, and that's how we'll add the beads. So we'll do a blue, a pink, blue, pink. So 1 blue bead and 1 pink bead. All right, so now we have the beads added for our first and second row. So I'm going to push these beads now towards the tail of the thread. And we're going to start adding the beads for the third row. So we're just going to add one bead now from the third row. Then we're going to pass through the second bead, or the second last bead, added in those first two rows. So you'll see that new bead added is now stacked on top of that first row bead. So then you continue adding a single bead from your third row. So we've added a new bead. So now we're going to skip one bead and sew through the next bead. So we're sewing through all the blue beads here. And our yellow beads should stack on top of the pink beads. So see, there we go. So I pick up the next bead from our third row, the yellow bead. We're going to skip one bead and pass through the next bead, which is our blue bead. So we're just adding one bead at a time. But for peyote, we are actually sewing through the bead, but we're skipping. So skip one bead, sew through to the next. All right, so now we're just sewing back through the last blue bead. So this will be our last bead for the third row. There you go. And then you just pull it taut at the end of the row. But you have to twist it a little bit just because we don't have a lot of beads added. You may twist a little bit. So as you can see, the structure here that you start to create is one bead up and one bead down. That is the structure of peyote. And you work typically from right to left or left to right. And you keep alternating in that manner, going back and forth, back and forth. For the third row, we went from right to left. So now for this fourth row, we're going to be working from left to right. So yeah, I guess we could start with the fourth row. So that'll be my green bead. To start the row, you just add one bead for peyote stitch. You'll sew through that third row bead. So here will be the yellow bead. You sew through the third row beads. And you just keep on going from left to right to finish that row. So the beads now that are up are all the beads from that third row. And we just go through the fourth row, just filling in those gaps. So it's really easy because now you start to see where you're going to add the new beads. It starts to get really obvious where you're adding that new bead and where you're sewing your needle through. But the tension for some reason does come out a bit looser in peyote stitch compared to brick stitch. I think that's just because of the structure. So it's important to pull your thread taut at the end of each row. So that's peyote stitch. So believe it or not, peyote can also be a circular peyote, and it can also be done in 3-dimensional work as well. Pretty cool, eh? So there you have it. These are some of the basic bead weaving techniques. On the left we have the brick stitch, on the right we have the peyote. So as you can see, if you flip the peyote on its side, wow, it looks exactly like the brick stitch. They can be very similar. However, they are very different techniques, as you can see. So it doesn't necessarily matter which stitch you choose for your work. Both stitches can actually produce the same patterns. So it's really just based on your preference and which technique you prefer. I hope you enjoyed this video and you learned something. So please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time, friends. Bye for now.